Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and if you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. And one thing you could do that would really help us if you would rate and review the show on iTunes. We've been told that this means that it moves up in the ratings and more people can find us, but thanks very much to everyone who's been listening to the show, contacting us, sharing it on social media. Now today I'm talking with my co-presenter John Dorney, because there's been a very happy event recently. John's new book has been published. Can you tell us about that, John?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. My new book is called The Civil War in Dublin, The Fight for the Irish Capital 1922 to 24. It's a product of about 4 years of research and writing. And I'm very happy to say it's being launched on the 22nd of August 2017.
And it's already in the shops now?
Already in the shops, yeah.
There's a bit of a shameless plug, so if anyone is interested, I'm sure you'll be able to get it in any good bookshops or online, Kindle editions, anything like that.
Yeah, published by Merriam Press.
I've been reading the different chapters as you've been writing it, and I found it really fascinating. And can you tell us some of the things you found when you were writing it, like the different archives you were using?
I started off kind of my curiosity about the Civil War, and the first source I went to maybe 5 years ago was the newspaper archives, and you do get a good general picture there. You start to get a lot more insights when you look at the archival sources. So the first one I went to was the National Army Archive, which is in Colborough Barracks, the military archive, and which tells you a lot from the Free State point of view, from their point of view of their military. The next place I went was the Moss Toomey Archive in UCD. Now, Moss Toomey was the chief of staff of the IRA in the 20s and 30s, but he was quite a senior IRA figure at the time. But the significance of his archive is that it has all the anti-treaty IRA papers of all the commands actually, but including Dublin and including GHQ during the Civil War. In UCD also, the Richard Mulcahy papers, which has a lot of the government material from the provisional government and the Free State government. The De Valera papers, which has a lot of De Valera's political thinking. De Valera also amassed a lot of other material on the Civil War. The Todd Andrews archive, Maura Comerford. There's a lot of people's personal archives are in UCD. Also, a lot of help were recently opened. Things like the military service pensions were really a lot of help in identifying casualties, identifying rank and file members, but also in some very surprising and interesting stories that rank and file members had to tell, which they had to say for their pensions. And lastly, the Bureau of Military History. Now, the Bureau is less help possibly on the Civil War than some other periods, but there is nevertheless some very interesting and sometimes very surprising stories in there as well. So, I mean, I benefited from new archives and old, really, but that's about it.
And when you're addressing a subject like the Irish Civil War, and it's been written about previously, other people have written books about it, when you read those books, what made you think, there's more I can add to this?
Well, I mean, until pretty recently, in historiographical terms, there was almost nothing written about the Irish Civil War except for polemical kind of pamphlets from one side or the other, generally from the Republican point of view, to be honest. Michael Hopkinson's book, if back in the 80s, Green Against Green, is probably the first archival book, or book based on archival research about the Civil War. And there have been some local studies, but nothing really about Dublin. Poor Gates had a book a couple of years ago, but that's kind of a social history. It's not really a history of the Civil War. It's like talking about Dublin at the time of the Civil War. I didn't think the story had been told, basically. And what hadn't been told? Well, innumerable things, really. I mean, just, the fact that Dublin was once a battleground between Irish nationalists is something that still shocks and surprises me, even after all these years of reading about it. I mean, I walk around Dublin and I see sites, especially older parts of Dublin, where there's almost always a Civil War connection. There's always something shocking or macabre happened in this place. And that just, on a very basic level, just still surprises and shocks me. Things like the fact that there was a death squad, for want of a better word, on the pro-treaty side in Dublin, which I discovered quite a few years ago, but I now know, I think, quite a lot more about, is a shocking thing that most people aren't aware of. The fact that those people are so intimately connected to Michael Collins' squad and his intelligence department in the IRA before the truce. And the fact that the very same group of people were involved in this bitter infighting on their own side, so they were ousted from their positions halfway through the Civil War, and they ended up attempting basically a military coup at the end of the Civil War, so almost another round of Civil War. These are stories which I think haven't been really told before. But also the thinking of the anti-treaty side, I'm not sure anyone had really explained the thinking before. So even in Michael Hopkinson's book, which or rest in peace, by the way, Michael Hopkinson died last year, I think. But even in Michael Hopkinson's book, the anti-treaty side are portrayed as bumbling, and they're incompetent, and they have no idea what they're doing, and it's all pointless. And when you really look at their archives, you see that's, however incompetent people may or may not have been, there is a kind of logic. I mean, there was reasons why things happened. Like, for example, to give a good example, Halpin, who wrote a good book about the Irish security forces since Irish independence, has a chapter on the Civil War, and he wrote that a lot of the anti-treaty campaign was pointless and so forth. And he gives the example of an episode in County Mayo where they released the hares from a coursing meeting. And he said, and this shows the pointless kind of vandalism. Now, it turns out that, for example, what this was in response to a General Headquarters order from Liam Lynch banning public entertainments in response to executions. So he declares a period of public mourning. So it's not that the people in Mayo, whoever did that, were senseless fools bent on, watching the world burn. They're following orders. Whatever we may think of the orders is another thing. But what you actually find is a lot of the anti-treaty campaign is actually driven by orders from above. A lot more than we might think. And another good example is the burning of houses, burning of country mansions, but also the burning of ordinary houses of supporters of the Free State, members of the Senate, members of the Dáil. This has often been put down, especially the big houses, to local grudges against landlords, things like this. Sectarianism. And you see, while those things might have played some part, it's not really the case that they're driving events. The burnings start very suddenly in December 1922 in response to an order from Liam Lynch that houses of Free State supporters are traitors and their houses must be burnt as a matter of course. And he gives this as a general order. The burnings start quite suddenly after that. And they finish, with the end of the Civil War. They finish, after Lynch's death. So the anti-treaty campaign, whether it's senseless in totals or so forth, it's not really because it doesn't happen because of some sort of senseless desire to burn down the country or anything like that. It is actually much more directed than we might think.
And it's a very contentious subject, the Civil War, the Irish Civil War. When you were reading through secondary material and reading through articles and books that people have written before on the period, one of the big criticisms seemed to be that Irish academia is very hostile to the anti-treatyites, and there's an inbuilt hostility that perhaps wouldn't be there if they were analysing a conflict in another country.
Yeah, or even the conflict against the British, I suppose. Yes, for the most part that's true. I mean, I'm not into tearing down Irish academia, or I'm not into fighting, these feuds that go on in Irish history between revisionists and anti-revisionists or so on. But it's fairly rare to find something in Irish academia which I wouldn't expect to support either side actually in the Civil War, but which tries to understand or explain where the anti-treatyites are coming from. It's quite rare to see that. I mean, what you see, I think, too much is people adopting the pro-treaty line, the pro-treaty rhetoric, that this is a war for democracy and it's a war for the rule of law and so on. And there's clear influences of the modern troubles on that. The fact that you have an illegal organisation, even today, which still calls itself the IRA, and which is inimical to the state's interests and the state's security. I think that plays a lot in Irish academic history, I'm sorry to say, because it's, as I said, it's quite rare to find people writing stuff which is unbiased. Now, in terms of popular history, it should be said there is more Republican popular history, a lot more than there is pro-treaty. So that suffers from the opposite defect, really, where you have people using uncritically terms like the Free State Army and so forth, and even sometimes terms like Free Staters, and making excuses for the side that they choose. So you do see it on some sides, but there does seem to be too much partisanship and polemic in the tone of Irish academic writing, I would still say, about the Civil War.
Well, we're coming up to the commemoration now of the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. How do you think that commemoration is going to cover it?
I don't know. I mean, one of the things is that the state seems to feel that at the moment that they've done enough, so they disbanded their commemoration committee after 2016, I believe. I don't think the state really would particularly like to commemorate details of the Civil War, which is understandable. Apparently, they're thinking about one-off events to say how terrible it all was and so forth. I must say, in terms of public commemorations, it doesn't bother me at all how people commemorate the Civil War or any other event in Irish history. I'm not a big believer in commemoration, to be honest. I think it's much more important for people who are serious about history to understand it than it is to shape the narrative today. I mean, I understand how that's important for politicians and so forth, but it's not something I will lose any sleep over.
Well, getting back specifically to this being a Dublin conflict, although obviously it was a countrywide conflict, but your research, your book covers specifically Dublin. How did you find it looking into areas that you were familiar with, areas where you grew up with, particularly around like the south side of Dublin?
Yeah, it's very eerie. It really is. I mean, I went to college in Griffith College. I did a journalism course there in 2009, 2010. And I mean, Griffith College at the time was Wellington Barracks or Griffith Barracks. And I mean, the stuff that happened there is hair-raising. You know, and I've walked around these places a million times, but I mean, there's a room which is now near the reception of Griffith College, which the intelligence officers used to beat the living daylights out of prisoners. I mean, they beat them with bayonets and with barbed wire, you know, and stuck guns in their mouths and so on. And a number of the people who went in there never came out, you know, or they came out dead, you know, they were driven somewhere else and killed. On the parade square, which is now at this very moment being built over, actually, it's going to be a national school, but on the parade square, the anti-treaty IRA machine gunned the soldiers on parade, and they climbed up to the rooftops of the buildings surrounding there, and machine gunned the unarmed soldiers. But there was a prisoner escape in November 22. They had the military courts there where they sentenced prisoners to death, and so on and so on. I mean, it's hair-raising to me when I walk around these places. And the same is true to a degree of places like Beggar's Bush Barracks, which looks very much like it did back then, except for it's not a barracks anymore. Cahill Barracks, which was Portobello Barracks. But also, I mean, sites in Rathmines where, for example, Frank Power, an anti-treaty IRA man, a student, like many anti-treatyites in the area actually, attempted to assassinate Richard Mulcahy at I think it's Lissadell House, and he was gunned down, you know, by the sentries. There's the little monuments around Dublin to the anti-treatyites that the National Graves Association later put up. And of course, things like the forecourts. And I mean, I can't walk by the forecourts without seeing it in 1922 when it was under artillery and rifle fire. Yeah, I mean, for me, probably now at this stage, you know, these places in Dublin will always be associated with the Civil War.
Particularly Oriel House as well. I used to walk
House.
by that a million times, and I never knew the history of it.
Yeah, and Oriel House, of course, was the headquarters of the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, which was a pro-treaty police organisation, but let's say it had a fairly robust reputation.
And for people reading the book, even people who would have a big interest in Irish history and the history of that period, what do you think would be the most surprising things they'd find in the book that hadn't really been covered before, either in other books or just in documentaries to popular history? I'm
going to turn that around on you, Cahill. So you've read most of the book.
Yeah.
What did you find surprising?
I suppose one of the things that really shocked me was the levels of indiscipline within certain sections of the National Army and the Officer Corps particularly. I was really, really surprised how that level of indiscipline was allowed to continue within the army for so long.
Yeah, and like this is one of the interesting stories about the book. It could almost be a book on its own, the story of the squad and intelligence people from Michael Collins' days in the IRA who became basically a kind of faction within the National Army. And yeah, their indiscipline was almost unbelievable at times. I mean, apart from a section of them becoming what the anti-treatyites called the murder gang in Dublin, apart from that, they were drinking heavily. They were flying around Dublin in these cars that they had in tenders. They were beating prisoners, especially a number of them, like Joe Dolan and Frank Bolster in particular. And then in late 1922, finally Richard Mulcahy, the Chief of Staff of the Army, just got fed up, not so much with the crimes that they were committing, but just the indiscipline and the lack of efficiency. Like, for example, Dan Bryan, who later on was the Chief of Intelligence of the Irish Army in the emergency period, but at the time was a junior intelligence officer, he commented that early on in the Civil War they captured plenty of documents and intelligence. They could have crushed the anti-treatyites within a month in Dublin, but none of it was ever analysed because the lads in the intelligence department in Portobello and in Wellington would sit around waiting for the next tip-off so they could go and raid and shoot somewhere up. Now, when Richard Mulcahy finally managed to oust them from the heads of intelligence, he ousted Liam Tobin and Charlie Dalton in particular, and replaced them with his own men, basically I think Dermot O'Hagerty and Sean O'Murhila, who were IRB men close to him. And he shunted Dalton and Tobin and various others off into minor jobs, and things like the Railway Maintenance Corps of the Army, the Special Infantry Corps, things which were not of great importance. Dalton was made adjutant to the Air Corps, which was a much less important job than it sounds. These guys, there's numerous testimonies in the Army Inquiry after the Civil War. They hung around Dublin. They would travel down the country wherever they thought was a hotspot. They seem to have been involved in the Ballyseedy massacre which another former squadman, Paddy O'Daly, commanded. But I mean, accounts also talk of the visiting committee from Dublin, which sounds very much like these men. But when they weren't doing that, they hung around Griffith Barracks, as it then was, drinking round the clock, more or less. They shot at an officer who tried to close the bar early. And I mean, just after the Civil War, in a personal vendetta, a number of intelligence officers, particularly James Conroy, who's a former squadman, shot dead two Dublin Jews, because a woman of their acquaintance said she'd been sexually assaulted by a Jewish dentist. So this is the mentality. These men decided to go after all Jews. I mean, they killed 2 Jews and they shot at a number more. There's also evidence of them, breaking into places. There's evidence of CID men doing hold-ups. An incredible level of indiscipline. And these people are only kicked out of the army when they attempted a mutiny and a coup in March 1924. It's a very dark tale, and I hope people will be surprised by it.
The other thing I suppose as well that I found interesting is the level of demoralisation and the state of the anti-treaty forces, both political and military, at the end of the Civil War. And I suppose it's interesting that they were able to build their forces back, politically at least, to the point where Fianna Fáil could come into government in 1932, because they look like a movement that's utterly defeated at the end of the Civil War.
Yeah. The kind of the import of your question kind of goes beyond the scope of my book, but yeah, I mean, they're totally beaten. I mean, from a military point of view, at the end of the Civil War, like at the start of the Civil War, there's in the fighting that goes on in Dublin, there's probably as many as 2,000 anti-treatyites involved in fighting in one way or another. Not all of them are armed. I mean, there's 700 arrested. There's more go down to Blessington and so forth. But people operated as runners and so forth, and some people and so on. Now, at the end of the Civil War, there's I think less than 200 anti-treatyites, that are catalogued by their own people. The rest of them are all in jail. I mean, about 85 are killed, and then another 3 are killed after the ceasefire. But mostly in jail. I mean, there's over 1,500 in jail from Dublin alone, out of a total of about 12,000 in the country. They have very few arms. They have like maybe 20 rifles in Dublin. And Dublin includes basically Wicklow and Kildare, because they were included in the Dublin Brigade areas of the IRA. They have a few handguns, they're very little explosive. I mean, militarily, they're totally beaten. Politically, the weird one about the aftermath of the Civil War is that the Republicans are, of course, not beaten. And they actually do better in the election after the Civil War than they did in the election before it. A fact that I must say I find very hard to explain, except for there is support for them. About a third of the electorate still supports them. And to be quite frank with you, I can't explain that. I think that might be a very fruitful area for another person to examine the Republican movement, and the Republican movement that becomes Fianna Fáil and the appeal of it in the late 20s. That might be a very interesting area to look at.
As well, one of the things that you look into, when you mentioned there the actual membership of the anti-treaty forces in Dublin during the Civil War, and what effect it must have to lose so much of your officer corps, even down to your junior officers being arrested, being left with an organisation that's staffed by very young and inexperienced volunteers. Yeah. I mean, of course, the great weakness the anti-treatyites had was that most of the IRA intelligence headquarters staff was on the other side, and even a lot of the people like Dan Bryan, for example, who was a very astute intelligence officer, had been a ordinary IRA IO, as they called, intelligence officer in 4th Battalion, and Coughlin, who was the head of 4th Battalion, was also on the other side. So the intelligence the other side had on them was very good. A lot of their officers were arrested early on. A lot of the senior officers were arrested during the Civil War. So Joe O'Connor, the head of 3rd Battalion, who was really the most active battalion commander. Ernie O'Malley, of course, the commander of the Eastern Division, is arrested in November 1922. Frank Henderson, who takes over, he's arrested in March 23. At the very start of the Civil War, I should have said, even Oscar Traynor, the head of the Dublin Brigade, he's arrested. And like you said, it goes down the line. I mean, and by the end, the people who are doing the business, for want of a better word, for the anti-treaty IRA are people like Bobby Bonfield, who is a medical student, a dental student, his friend Tommy O'Leary, also a UCD student, both very young. They're both killed, both assassinated, in reprisal for all the things they themselves had done, to be fair. People like Bill Rowe, who was an ordinary IRA volunteer before the truce, and it became the head of the anti-treaty ASU in Dublin. And more or less these people are not quite acting independently, but they're getting instructions, and then whatever they do after that is up to them. And by the end of the Civil War, people are saying things like, I couldn't get in touch with any officers, so I just hid out or I stayed at home for fear of being arrested. So, yeah, I mean, they're really totally beaten by the end of the Civil War. Now, one of the things that struck me when I was reading through your book was just the recklessness of some of the actions, the engagements around heavily populated parts of the city centre. Some of it is really, really shocking.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and this was a problem before the truce as well. You know, I mean, the Dublin Brigade, you know, in both the War of Independence and the Civil War, their modus operandi was to throw grenades at patrols in crowded streets. And before the Civil War, in the War of Independence, you know, Cathal Brugha and Michael Collins ended up having a big row about this, because Cathal Brugha, the Minister for Defence of the Dáil, tried to veto this. You know, Cathal Brugha is obviously an anti-treatyite and he's killed in the first week of the Civil War, but the anti-treatyites are no better in the Civil War. They're probably even worse. And there's really, in terms of preserving civilian life, there's incredibly reckless attacks, really. Like, basically, you have 3 or 4 arteries into the city along the quays, on Angier Street, Camden Street area, from Rathmines, from Portobello Barracks into the city centre, and what today is the road north out of the city towards the airport. In those days, Dublin Airport was just a small military aerodrome that the British Army was still in for most of the Civil War. Actually, on these streets and also on smaller streets, the anti-treaty IRA would throw these improvised grenades and they would fire, you know, usually revolver shots. And I mean, there's a day in September, particularly 1922, I think September 13th, if I remember correctly, where, you know, the hospitals fill up with, I think, 23 civilian casualties. You know, on places like Henry Street, which is then as now was a shopping street, you know, on the quays on Eden Quay, in Drumcondra Road. You can certainly understand how the anti-treatyites would have been very unpopular with the general public, because they're putting their lives at risk by their campaign. And certainly, also, this is something that the pro-treaty press, so the Freeman's Journal in particular, is very vituperative about. Like, they say that they're cowards, they're hiding behind civilians, they're playing at being soldiers, you know, they're putting civilians' lives at risk because they're not men enough to face the national soldiers in open combat. Now, obviously, this is just polemical, but it certainly, you know, it stands up to a certain amount of scrutiny as well. I mean, even in, for example, I mentioned the attack on Wellington Barracks, which is an attack on a military target, but I mean, they managed to hit 3 civilians in this attack. William Warren, for example, is a butcher's boy and he's shot in the chest. The Irish Independent mentions a man called Keane, who I haven't otherwise been able to identify, but he's killed in the crossfire in that attack. You know, any so-called success of the anti-treatyites in Dublin usually involves civilian casualties. Having said that, I mean, you know, the most common cause of death for civilians was in the crossfire of the first week of the Civil War, where I found I was able to track down the names of 35 civilians who were killed in the first week of the Civil War in the crossfire, and it's you know, the inquest says by persons unknown. It's not known which side was responsible, and it could well have been either side, to be fair. But that total 35 civilians is too low, because, for example, I went to Dean's Grange Cemetery records, and they don't give the cause of death, unlike other cemeteries. But I mean, in that week, which is like from June 28th to July 7th in Dublin, there are, I think, 20 or 30 more people in their 20s and teens who are buried there. Mm-hmm. And you don't find that in any other comparable week in 1922 or 23. So I think it's safe to... And also, during that fighting, the coroner's office sends a message to the government, and this is in the Mulcahy papers, where they say, there's too many bodies, we want to stop inquests. Mm-hmm. So I think it's safe to say that actually, you know, you're probably looking at 50 plus civilians killed in the first week of the Civil War. And while, you know, there's certainly reckless attacks afterwards, the biggest killer is actually this kind of conventional fighting at the very start of the Civil War.
Could that be one of the reasons, do you think, where that popularity for the anti-treatyites politically doesn't really materialise in Dublin as it does in other parts of the country? Yeah,
you know, you're looking at a very kind of localised picture, though. I mean, you know, like the anti-treatyites might be popular in one area because of very specific kind of personality things. In some areas, they're popular or relatively popular because they associate themselves in the Civil War period with land agitation, and they give land to their supporters. That's certainly true in places like Leitrim and Cavan, where I looked at before. It's such a varied picture, I kind of wouldn't want to comment, you know. And in terms of the Civil War, like in Dublin, the picture of the civilian population and their support for either side is really pretty fluid. Like, first of all, if we take the elections in Dublin as a barometer, there's a lot of neutral votes. There's a lot of votes for independents and Labour Party and people who had been in the Parliamentary Party, the Redmondites. Like Alfie Byrne is the classic example. But there's also, the striking thing is in 1923, after the Civil War, there's a lot of people who transfer across the Treaty Divide. I mean, people who elected Richard Mulcahy in Dublin North also elected Ernie O'Malley. Ernie O'Malley was elected on transfers, second preference votes from Richard Mulcahy. So there's still a lot of people who don't take either side or who regretted the Civil War happened, you know. it's such a strange conflict that it's very difficult to pin down people's allegiances, I would say.
Well, what do you think are the most common misconceptions about civil war in Dublin at the end, after having written the book and after all your research?
I think people really don't have an idea that there was a civil war in Dublin. Like, I mean, I talked to someone who was quite well informed, a relative of mine, and she said, oh, well, there was no civil war in Dublin after the forecourts fighting. And that's just not the case. I mean, there was, like I said, I think I accounted for 81 casualties of the first week, and I think it's probably well over that. But I mean, there's over 150 casualties afterwards, fatal casualties, and like 500 to 600 wounded as well. So, I think the main popular misconception is just that there wasn't a civil war in Dublin, and there was,
Mm-hmm. Well, getting back onto the civilian side of things and what it must have been like for a civilian to live in Dublin at the time with all this going on, one of the things I found interesting in your book when I was reading it was about the amusements order and just the day-to-day life, the social life in Dublin. What was the amusements order?
The amusements order was something that was drafted at the top of the IRA executive, the anti-treaty IRA, in February 1923, in response to the government execution policy. And by that time, by February 1923, there had already been 50 plus executions, of which I think 15 or 20 were in Dublin. The amusements order was forbidding public entertainments, public amusements, as they called them, during a period of national mourning. So while, as the anti-treatyites put it, while Irish soldiers have been done to death in illegal courts, and that's their language. So it's forbidding people going to the cinema, people going to the theatre, it's forbidding things like coursing, golf. Interestingly enough, it did not mention the very popular sporting events like the Gaelic football or hurling or soccer or rugby for that matter, which is kind of interesting exclusion. But the executions were suspended in February 1923. There was an amnesty, and they were started again in March, partly because of the Ballyseedy massacre, actually, where Kevin O'Higgins insisted this illegal thing had happened because they weren't executing enough people legally. And the executions were restarted. And the anti-treaty executive, or to be precise, Liam Lynch, the chief of staff, over the objections of Eamon de Valera, the so-called president of the anti-treaty opposition government, I suppose, or underground government, he gave a general order that all volunteers must enforce the amusements order. So there were to be notices were sent to cinemas, to theatres, to sporting organisations, golf clubs and so forth, that there was to be no public entertainments at this time. Now, the government reacted. I mean, one of the things, like, this might seem a kind of a crazy thing to do. We're going to shut down the theatres and the cinemas. But they were dead serious about this. And B, the government reacted really harshly, or the government reacted really seriously to this. This was considered a really serious challenge, defiance of the government's authority. And when you think about it, it's the symbolism that's important. So if the anti-treaty IRA can forbid people from doing things, it means that they have kind of the power of a government. They can force people to act in a certain way. So the government reacts really harshly, as I said, or harshly is maybe the wrong word, but really seriously to this. They deploy 2 battalions of troops on the streets of central Dublin, for example. They deploy the CID, which is the Armed Detective Unit, the CDF, which is another one, because there was a proliferation of these plainclothes units, the Protective Corps. There's about 150 of these armed plainclothes operatives. And they're put to work guarding theatres and cinemas and forcing them to open, right? And the import of this is that you don't obey the irregulars, as they call the other side, you obey us, the government. So the anti-treaty IRA duly tries to enforce its order, and for example, there's a world title boxing match in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day 1923. Now, whose idea it was...
I found this fascinating in the book.
Whose idea it was to schedule a world title boxing match in a city that's plagued by political violence, I do not know. But they imported this French African boxer, Battling Siki, as he was known, and an Irishman, Mike McTeague, and they fought out this match on O'Connell Street on Princess Street, and the IRA duly detonated a landmine next door, and they fired shots at the military guard. While the anti-treaty order isn't intended to Bataclan style massacre people going to the cinema or theatre, it could easily have ended like that. So there's fires in these cinemas, mostly when they're empty, there's bombs, but it just takes one mistimed bomb to have a massacre of civilians. They're a hair's breadth away from it. There's a number of other bombs let off at famous cinemas in Dublin, including the Savoy, the Carlton. An anti-treaty IRA volunteer, Peter O'Connell, if I recall his name correctly, is shot dead trying to lay a bomb in the Carlton cinema. It's a fairly horrific thing. I mean, you're going to the theatre, the next thing a bomb goes off. It's probably the worst example of this blatant kind of disregard for civilian life that you see sometimes on behalf of the anti-treatyites. And one final kind of coda to the story of the amusements order is a CDF man, Frank Teeling, who was another pre-truce IRA man, who was captured after Bloody Sunday and escaped execution by escaping from Kilmainham jail, I think. He was about to be hanged by the British. Teeling goes off the rails in a very serious way during the truce period. He's drinking very heavily. He's involved in a very suspicious shooting of another National Army soldier up in Gormanstown in the camp there. And during the period of the amusement order, while this kind of anarchy is raging in Dublin, where there's bombs and fires and stuff, Teeling shoots dead another CDF man in the I think the Royal Theatre in Dublin. I'm not sure where that was. No. He shoots another CDF man in a theatre because the other man made him drop his bag of tomatoes. And this shows the mental state that Teeling was in at the time. Actually, the cabinet had discussed sending him abroad the week before, and they just didn't get the chance because then he had to be sent to prison. But and there's also, on the night of the boxing match, there's also a number of incidents of friendly fire. So Daniel MacDonald, who's actually the commander of the Dublin Brigade of the National Army, is shot in the chest by his own troops in Phoenix Park. National Army troops fire on CID men in the streets. It's a very nervous time in Dublin as well.
So apart from the conflict going on in Dublin, obviously, the conflict in the rest of the country, how did that impact on Dublin? Say, for example, even the conflict in the north at the time.
Yeah, well, this kind of predates the Civil War, so it's the period just before the outbreak of fighting between the factions in Dublin. And basically what happens is, due to the conflict in the north, which was very severe in early 1922, when there's about 500 people killed in the north, and the vast majority of whom are civilians, and the majority within that civilian group is Catholics or nationalists. The refugees kind of flood south from the north. There might have been up to 20 or 30,000 refugees from the north into 26 counties. Quite a few came to Dublin. The government records record 1,200, but to be honest, I'm sure it was more than that. And there's this weird kind of competition between the pro and anti-treaty sides. Now remember, this is in the period before the Civil War, where they're kind of uneasily coexisting. There's a weird competition between the two sides to house the Belfast refugees. And one of the very interesting things from our perspective is that the anti-treaty IRA sees all this unionist property in Dublin. Now, not just ordinary unionists or ordinary Protestants, but politically aligned buildings like the Orange Order Hall, which there was at the time in Fowler's Hall in Parnell Square. They took that over and they housed refugees there, Belfast refugees. They took over the Freemasons Hall, which is still there on Molesworth Street. They put refugees there. The Kildare Street Club, which was a club of kind of high Tories, that kind of unionist, on Kildare Street. They took that over. They stuck the refugees in there. Basically, as well as helping the refugees, there's a kind of symbolism going on here. So they're saying we are the real enemies of unionism. We're the real defenders of Northern nationalists. And the government is very concerned about this for a number of reasons. One, it's defying their authority. And secondly, it's upsetting people such as the British and, people who are close to the British, like former unionists, who they basically need in this period to consolidate the new state. So they're also concerned because it's kind of stealing a march on this idea that they're the leaders of nationalist Ireland. So the government has to open their own home for refugees, which they opened in Glasnevin, in a place called Marlborough Hall, and they housed further refugees there. So one of the other weird things, though, is a lot of the northern refugees who are aligned to the IRA or who are otherwise kind of self-defence fighters in the north end up in the Curragh camp, so in County Kildare, not far from Dublin. And the weird thing from our perspective is they almost all joined the National Army, the pro-treaty army. So in a way, they fight for a settlement which secures partition. It's not what they intended to do, but that's what they kind of ended up doing. There are one or two northern anti-treaty people in Dublin. Michael Carolan is the most prominent. He's the director of intelligence, who incidentally was a very sharp man. I happened to read through a lot of his papers that he wrote to Liam Lynch. And Joe McKelvey, of course, was one of the Four Courts leaders who was executed in December 1922, who had been head of the Belfast IRA. But in general, the Northern IRA men end up on the pro-treaty side for a number of reasons. One, because Michael Collins assures them that partition is permanent and that the treaty is not about partition, that Northern Ireland won't continue to exist. And because he says, we now have a government, we have arms, we have funds, we can give this to you. What can the other side give you? And as a result, you have some very odd things, like Roger McCorley, who had been a kind of a firebrand leader of the ASU, of the Belfast Brigade of the IRA, in the pre-truce period, ends up as a Free State soldier in Dublin and in Kerry, two locations where the Civil War was most intense. He ends up doing things like leading parties which broke into Mountjoy prison to restore order after the prisoners rioted, and firing on prisoners and beating them. The pro-treaty IRA people in Dublin, who I mentioned before, who formed a very particular faction, Collins' former squad men, really disliked the amount of northern soldiers who were in the National Army in Dublin, and they complained that they were being given jobs ahead of their own faction, actually. But one of the interesting things you find about the Northern IRA men is that they were much less, by and large now, with the exception of Roger McCorley, who is accused of some excesses, by and large the Northern IRA men were much less brutal than former Dublin IRA men who were pro-treaty. And there's a number of cases I've found where anti-treaty IRA men are captured in the act, captured with arms, and they're terrified of being shot on the spot, which is quite reasonable. And they found out that their captors were Northern men, and they were relieved. And the Northern men said things like, there'll be no pluggings here. And they said, we'll keep you away from those murderers. There's actually cases where they said this. Northern IRA men seem to have been less vested in what was essentially kind of a southern squabble. And, a lot of the Northern men drifted back home afterwards. And I suppose they must have wondered what it was all for in the end. Because things certainly didn't work out as they intended.
Well, I think the biggest thing I got out of the book was being able to look at the Civil War just purely through a Dublin context. There's so much emphasis when you read about the Civil War, about Kerry, about the Munster landings, about different things. But as you said before, the Civil War story seems to stop at the forecourts whenever there's a wider, countrywide book about the Civil War. So I think I got quite a lot out of the information, and particularly the personalities involved, reading about what they did and what happened to them during the Civil War. That's what I think one of the most important things I got out of it, because some of the individual stories are just completely fascinating, particularly with people who wouldn't be well known beforehand, even ordinary soldiers or ordinary members of the IRA. I think one of the stories that I found interesting was about the National Army soldiers. I think Pinkman was his name.
Yeah, John Pinkman.
Yeah, who was just taking pot shots at buildings out of boredom, or just walking off and leaving his rifle. I thought that was it's incredible in the context of what was going on all around him.
Yeah, Pinkman's memoir, which is called Soldiers of the Vanguard, in a very pointed Civil War dig, is actually a Liverpool IRA man who was arrested in Britain during the War of Independence and repatriated to Ireland, and he joins the National Army. And yeah, he's an incredibly ill-disciplined character. Like, he's stationed on Marlborough Street during the fighting, which is the back of the block, the anti-treaty position, and nothing much is going on after a few days. So he gets bored and takes a Lewis machine gun, and he decides to spray the YMCA building, which is across the road on O'Connell Street, with bullets to see if he could knock out all the windows, and without knowing which side was in sight. And it turns out that it's occupied by the irregulars, as he calls them, and he manages to hit the gas main, and the whole place goes up. But he could easily have been shooting on his own side, he just didn't know. And then after that he gets bored and he turns in the other direction and takes up the rifle and sees if he can shoot out all the windows on Cathedral Street. So, and after that, like I said, yeah, he decided the billet he was given wasn't comfy enough, so he decided to go off and stay the night in a hotel, not pay, and shoot at anyone who approached him. It's a remarkably honest memoir.
I think one of the things that I found interesting was particularly people talking about their experiences of the Civil War from the anti-treaty side after the fact, and the mental and physical toll that it took on them. Yeah.
Joe O'Connor would be probably the biggest one there. Like, Joe O'Connor's bureau statement is fairly grim. Like, he seems to have had a kind of a mental collapse after he was let out from prison, and things like when he heard a car backfiring, he assumed it was a gunshot and he ran for cover. He couldn't walk to work. His wife had to escort him to work. Like, he worked in Dublin Corporation in the rates department. Yeah, that's fairly stark. And also, things like Frank Sherwin, who later on was a long-time independent politician. But Frank Sherwin talks about, he interestingly enough, in his own memoir, Frank Sherwin says, I know now that it was wrong to fight against them because they were the elected government, which is obviously seeing it through the prism of someone who's been a TD for a long time and a councillor. But he says, I can never forgive them for what they did. And I mean, he never recovered the use of his arm after a beating he got in Wellington Barracks at the hands of Joe Dolan and Frank Bolster. One of the anecdotes I think people might find striking as well is Bill Rowe, who was the head of the ASU, as I said, has this remarkably candid interview with Ernie O'Malley in the 1930s. And one of the things I didn't actually manage to include in the book, because you can't include everything, is on this attack they make on Oriel House, which is the head of the CID, the detective division. Joe O'Connor is supposed to be in charge of it. He's the head of 3rd Battalion. and they're planning it, and the plan is to leave a mine in the basement and detonate it. And he asks Joe O'Connor, what am I to do with the CID men? Like the idea, and Joe O'Connor says, according to him, take them out and kick them in the rump and let them go.
Yeah.
And Bill Rowe says, Joe O'Connor's nickname incidentally was Holy Joe.
Yeah.
Right? So Bill Rowe seems to have had a thinly veiled kind of contempt for him. So Joe O'Connor basically tells him not to kill the CID men. Bill Rowe goes back to the SU and he says, yeah, we're going to kill them all. He says, we're going to detonate the bomb and hopefully we get them all. And Bill Rowe seems to have been a particularly bloodthirsty character. Bill Rowe was the guy who organised the Wellington Barracks attack, where, as I said, they machine gunned rows of soldiers. And what he says to Ernie O'Malley is it was an independent job because we figured we had to do something decent. So Rowe was a particularly bloodthirsty character. But like the bloodthirsty characters more or less on the other side, Rowe seems to completely get away with it. They're certainly looking for him and trying to kill him, but they never get him. And he never goes to jail either. And he has some hard time getting a job until his own side come to power later on. But, like many of the people who did the darkest things, he more or less totally gets away with it, from what I can see.
Well, that was one of the things that surprised me, not just from your book, but just reading about that period, is particularly when you read your book and you read about some of the stuff that happened, some of the atrocities, some of the treatment of prisoners, is how there weren't more scores settled in the years following the Civil War. Because, well, Dublin is a big city. It's not that big. You're going to bump into people.
Well, I want to tell two things about this, right? And the first thing is from the archives and stuff, and the second thing is a more personal story. The archive bit is Frank Aiken, when he succeeded Liam Lynch after Liam Lynch was killed down in Tipperary in April 1923, and Frank Aiken succeeds him as Chief of Staff of the IRA, very quickly calls a ceasefire, issues the Dump Arms Order, ends the Civil War, with a lot of advice, let's say, from Raymond de Valera. Now, one of the things that Aiken most concentrates on after the Civil War is this maintenance of discipline within the IRA. So he doesn't allow people to settle scores. And there is a faction within the IRA in Dublin, who I think are the ASU people actually, who call themselves the Republican Defence Corps. And they seem to have taken an arms dump, and with the idea of going and settling a few scores, like you said, precisely as you said. And apparently many people in Cumann na Man, the women's organisation, are particularly keen to see some scores settled. And Aiken forbids it, and he tells the OC of the Dublin Brigade, who I'm not sure who it was by that time actually, he tells him, you are authorised to use force to recover the weapons and force these people to disband. So the IRA is quite clear there is not going to be score settling. So they just don't allow it. Now there is some score settling later on in the sense that Kevin O'Higgins was murdered in 1927, but the likes of Charlie Dalton, Liam Tobin, Joe Dolan, Frank Bolster, Sean O'Connell even, people who we know were involved in what the anti-treatyites called the murder gang, who were certainly involved and named in inquiries, torturing prisoners, a hand was never put on them. And actually some of those people reconciled with the anti-treatyites later. Like, oddly enough, Liam Tobin, who was the head of anti-treaty intelligence, later gets a job from Raymond de Valera, I think as clerk of the Oireachtas, if I'm not mistaken. And some of them end up working together under Joe McGrath and the sweepstakes in the 20s and 30s. There's some odd things happen there. Okay, the second thing though, on the score settling thing though, is that doesn't mean there wasn't terrible animosity. So a man who I can't name, but who's a family friend and is not in great health now, he's quite old, but his father was an intelligence officer in 3rd Battalion of the Dublin Brigade. And he was a Republican himself. He was in the IRA in the 40s and 50s, into the 60s, I think. Now, he was taken by his father to go down for a job in a Midlands town. I forget the town, I'm not leaving that out on purpose. Sometime in the late 40s, early 50s. And they were sitting having lunch in a hotel restaurant. And suddenly his father told him to get up. He said, we're not staying here. And he said, why? He says, I'm not staying in the same room as that man. The man sitting opposite him, or sitting near him in the restaurant, was Michael Costello, who had a long career in the Irish Army, but who in late 1923 was the head of intelligence as a very young man. And Costello, certainly the man I'm talking about's father, blamed Costello for the murder of Joe Bergen. Joe Bergen was a National Army soldier actually who was working with the anti-treatyites. He was passing information out of the Curragh camp from the prisoners to the anti-treaty leadership. He was abducted and shot by a man named James Murray, acting more under the orders of Costello. Murray was imprisoned and died in prison actually for the murder of Joe Bergen, but a horrific murder I mean, the body was mutilated and found in the Grand Canal. Now, according to what my father's friend told me, his father got up, went over to the table, sat down, or stood over Costello and the man he was eating dinner with, and said, "I hope you know you're eating dinner with a murderer," and he walked out. And that's the kind of bitterness that was left after the Civil War.
Well, thanks very much, John, and I would recommend everyone, I know we're biased, but I would recommend everyone get a copy of John's book. It's really well worth a read. Thank you very much. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can get our Twitter, our Facebook, our YouTube, all there, and please rate and review the show on iTunes as well. That really helps. So from Cathal Brennan and John Dorney, thank you very much.